I knew the exact second my career at Cypherline was over. And it wasn't the moment security walked me to the elevator with my box of desk plants. It wasn't even the moment Julian Voss stood up in front of 42 employees and told them I was a liability. No, the real ending happened 8 months earlier, on a Tuesday morning, when a man in a $3,000 overcoat walked through our office doors carrying a coffee he didn't finish and a smile that never once reached his eyes. I'm Renee Vaughn. I don't have a podcast. I don't have a personal brand with a blue check mark and a bio that says founder, builder, disruptor. I'm the woman who used to sit in the back corner of the office with a pair of ancient noise-canceling headphones, writing code that quietly stopped banks, hospitals, and half a dozen government contractors from getting robbed blind by people they couldn't see coming. I built the thing that made the money move safely. Nobody puts that on a magazine cover. That's fine. I never wanted the cover. I wanted the engine to run. The engine was called Aegis. It still is, technically, though not for much longer under that name, and not under anyone's roof but mine. Aegis was a behavioral threat detection system, an AI core that watched the way money and data moved through a network and learned, in real time, what normal looked like for that specific institution, that specific set of humans, that specific rhythm of Tuesday morning payroll runs and Friday afternoon wire transfers. And when something stopped looking normal, when a login came from a device that walked differently than the real user, when a transaction had the digital equivalent of a nervous tell, Aegis flagged it before a human analyst would have finished their coffee. It caught a 9-figure fraud ring in its first year of deployment. It caught a nation-state intrusion into a regional hospital network in its second. It was, by any honest measure, the best thing I have ever built. And I built almost all of it, alone, in a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in the outer sunset, fueled by instant ramen and a stubbornness that my mother used to call, not always kindly, your father's mule streak. Here is the part that matters more than anything else in this story, the part you need to hold on to, because everything that happens later hinges on it. Before I ever signed a single document with Cypherline, before I took a cent of their money or a square foot of their office space, I did something that makes most corporate attorneys develop a nervous eye twitch. I kept the patent. Not co-owned it, not assigned it with a buyback clause, kept it, outright, in my name, through a holding company I'd set up specifically so nobody could ever say the founder and the IP were the same legal entity and get confused about which one they were allowed to fire. Cypherline didn't own Aegis. They licensed it. Think of it the way you'd think about renting out a Formula One engine to a company that wanted to slap it into a nice, presentable sedan and sell rides around the block. They could drive it. They could paint the hood. They could sell tickets and put up billboards with my algorithm's silhouette rendered in a friendlier font. But if they stopped paying, or if they broke the terms of the lease, really broke them, not, we were a little late on an invoice, broke them, but the kind of breach that a court doesn't need a magnifying glass to see, I could reach under that hood and take my engine back out. Clean, legal, written into a license agreement that had been drafted by a woman who bills $400 an hour and has never once lost a contract dispute in her career. Julian Voss did not know that, or he knew it and decided it didn't matter. The way men like him tend to decide inconvenient facts don't matter, until the inconvenient fact is standing in a courtroom wearing a very good suit. Hey, quick thing before I keep going, since I know some of you are new here. If you like stories where quiet, overlooked people turn out to be holding every card at the table the whole time, hit subscribe, drop a like, whatever keeps this channel's lights on. It genuinely helps. Okay, back to the wreckage. Julian was brought in by the board 8 months before that Tuesday, officially as CEO, unofficially as what the venture world calls a scale operator. A person whose entire professional identity is built around taking something that works and making it look bigger, shinier, and more acquirable, usually by any means that don't technically constitute a felony. He had a resume full of companies that had been positioned for exit under his leadership, which is a polite way of saying he'd been present at several funerals and left before the smell set in. He wore quarter-zip sweaters that cost more than my first car and had a habit of touching things that weren't his, picking up a prototype sensor off my desk, turning it over in his hands like a man appraising a rare coin, setting it down slightly out of place so that a small, petty part of you had to fight the urge to fix it after he left. "Renee, right?" he said to me that first morning, not quite looking at me, looking instead at the reflection of his own teeth in my monitor. "I love what you're doing here, really granular stuff, but we need to think bigger. We need to stop thinking security tool and start thinking trust infrastructure, category ownership, you know? It stops 9-figure fraud rings in real time," I said, my voice flatter than I meant it to be. "It's not a vibe. It's math." He laughed, a short, barking sound, like I'd told a joke I didn't understand the punchline of. "That's the engineer brain talking. I love it. But I need you thinking like a founder now, not a builder. We're positioning for a liquidity event. Meridian Capital is circling. You know Meridian?" I did. Everyone in the security world knew Meridian, a growth equity fund with a reputation for buying category leaders and squeezing every last drop of margin out of them before flipping them to someone bigger. $650 million on the table if the narrative's clean. Complexity scares money, Renee. "Complexity is the entire point," I said. "Complexity is what makes it work." He stopped smiling. Then he looked at me the way you'd look at a child trying to pay for groceries with a fistful of Monopoly money. Pity, dressed up as patience. "We'll work on your pitch," he said, patting my shoulder like I was a golden retriever who'd fetched the wrong stick. I flinched. He either didn't notice or didn't care. "We're going to make you a star, Ren. Just trust the process." The process, it turned out, was a slow-motion erasure. And it started so quietly that for weeks I told myself I was imagining it. If you've never worked in a place like Cypherline, let me explain something called the soft lockout, because it's not what people picture when they hear getting pushed out of a company. It's not dramatic. Nobody changes the locks on your office door. It's 1,000 tiny paper cuts, each one small enough to argue away on its own, until one day you look up and realize you've bled out your entire authority without a single meeting where anyone said the word fired. It started with my name disappearing from slide decks. Small things. The About Aegis slide that used to say, "Founded by Renee Vaughn, Chief Architect," quietly became "Powered by Cypherline's proprietary AI research division." No attribution, no byline. Like the algorithm had simply materialized out of the ambient hum of the building's HVAC system. Then the weekly research sync, a meeting I had run, personally, every Wednesday at 10 for 3 straight years, got rescheduled for better cross-functional alignment to a Tuesday slot that happened every single week to conflict with a recurring dentist appointment I'd mentioned exactly once, in passing, 11 months earlier. I noticed that. I noticed everything. That was, in a way, my whole job. I'd walk past the glass-walled conference room, we called it the fishbowl, and you'll understand why soon enough, and see Julian in there with the marketing team, gesturing at a whiteboard covered in a badly redrawn version of my architecture diagram, explaining recursive trust scoring to a room of people who thought a neural network was something you unplugged and plugged back in when it acted up. It was infuriating. But I told myself the thing every overworked, undervalued builder tells herself in that situation. I'm the golden goose. You don't shoot the goose. You pluck a few feathers, sure, make yourself a nice little pillow, but you don't kill the thing that's laying the eggs. That's what I told myself, sitting in my office some nights, watching the fog roll in low and gray over the bay, nursing coffee that had gone cold an hour before and tasted like it had personally wronged me. I told myself to keep my head down and focus on the work. Specifically, I told myself to focus on a continuation patent I'd quietly begun filing, an extension covering a new self-correcting trust model I'd been building on nights and weekends, on my own servers, under a clause in my original employment contract that explicitly carved out personal projects developed outside company infrastructure and company hours. I'll come back to that. Remember it. It matters more than almost anything else in this story. But the office kept getting heavier. You know that specific feeling of air pressure dropping before a storm? The one that makes your joints ache and the birds go quiet? That was the whole building for weeks. Junior engineers stopped making eye contact with me in the hallway. The shared team calendar sprouted blocks labeled Private Strategy Session that ate up whole afternoons and never once included my name on the invite list. And then, one Tuesday, in the break room, I found a piece of paper sitting face up on the counter next to the creamer, like it had been left there by accident. Or maybe not by accident at all. It was a printed email from Julian to the board. Legacy technical personnel are becoming a friction point in the Meridian narrative. Recommend streamlining IP attribution ahead of due diligence. I am handling the situation directly. Expect resolution before end of Q3. The situation. That was me. I wasn't chief architect of Cipherline anymore, not in the language that mattered. I was a friction point. A smudge on the lens of somebody else's $650 million photograph. I picked the paper up. My hand didn't shake. That's the thing you should know about me by now. I don't panic. I calculate. I folded that email into a small, precise square, sharp creases, tight corners, the way you fold something you intend to keep for a long time, and I put it in my jacket pocket. If Julian Voss wanted to play games, he really should have checked who'd written the rulebook first. He thought he was sitting down to a hand of poker. He had no idea he'd wandered into a chess match where I'd already moved my queen out 5 years earlier, long before he'd even heard the name Cipherline. I still didn't know, standing in that break room with the creamer sweating on the counter beside me, exactly how far he was willing to go. I didn't know yet that handling the situation meant burning my reputation to the ground before he ever tried to walk me to the door. I went back to my desk, unlocked the encrypted partition on my laptop, and opened a folder labeled, with the kind of dry humor you develop after 5 years of corporate warfare, Master License Final. Do not touch. PDF. I stared at Section 12, Founder Protections. I stared at Section 14B, the Revocation Clause, the nuclear option, the one Julian had almost certainly never bothered to read past the header. Try me, Alex, I whispered to the empty office, and then caught myself because his name wasn't Alex. His name was Julian. But somewhere in the back of my head, I'd already started filing him away under a category, a type, a pattern I'd seen before in other men in other conference rooms. Try me, Julian, I corrected, quietly, to nobody. Just try me. People ask me sometimes, or they used to, back when I still answered messages from strangers on LinkedIn, How a person ends up building something like Aegis alone, in an apartment above a laundromat, with a mule streak for a personality trait. The honest answer is that I didn't have a choice. Not really. My mother cleaned office buildings in downtown San Jose for 11 years, and some nights, when I was small, she'd take me with her because there was nobody else to watch me, and I'd sit under some tech executive's glass desk doing my math homework while she vacuumed a carpet that cost more per square foot than our entire apartment. I remember looking up at the monitors those men left on overnight, glowing blue in the dark, full of numbers I didn't understand yet, and thinking, someday, I'm going to be the one who understands that. I got there. Scholarship to a state school nobody in Silicon Valley brags about on a pitch deck. A master's I paid for by tutoring undergrads in linear algebra at $11 an hour. And then 6 years at 2 different security firms where I watched, over and over, brilliant technical work get credited to whichever man in the room spoke the loudest in the executive review. I learned 2 lessons in those 6 years that I never once forgot. The first was that competence, on its own, protects nobody. The second was that paperwork does. So when I finally left to build Aegis on my own, I didn't just build the algorithm. I built the legal architecture around it, brick by brick, with a ferocity that startled even my own lawyer the first time we met. Sarah, you'll meet her properly soon. She's the shark in this story, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give a person, told me in our very first consultation, most founders come in here wanting to talk about growth. You're the first one who's wanted to talk about exit scenarios where you get screwed. I told her that was because I intended to be prepared for exactly one scenario, the one where somebody eventually tried to screw me. She didn't laugh. She just started taking very careful notes. Cypherline came to me 2 years after I'd built the first working version of Aegis on my own, already deployed with 3 small credit unions who'd taken a chance on an unknown founder because I'd priced myself low enough to be worth the risk. Cypherline offered infrastructure, sales muscle, enterprise contacts I could never have built alone, and, crucially, they offered it on my terms, because by the time they came knocking, I already had leverage. And I already knew, down in my bones, that leverage was the only currency that mattered in rooms like theirs. I licensed them Aegis. I kept the patent. I took a board seat and the title of Chief Architect, and for 3 years, it worked beautifully. Then the board decided the company needed to professionalize, which is corporate for, we want someone who looks like the CEOs on the covers of the magazines we read on airplanes. And they hired Julian Voss. Hey, real quick, if you've ever built something at a company only to watch someone else's face end up on the pitch deck for it, I want you to know I see you, and this story is for you. Okay, moving on, because it gets worse before it gets better. The junior analyst incident happened on a Thursday, 6 weeks before the all-hands that ended everything. Her name was Chloe Ferreira, 23 years old, fresh out of a business analytics program, the kind of relentlessly earnest hire who says things like, circle back, and bandwidth without any apparent self-consciousness, and genuinely believes every task handed to her is an opportunity for growth. Julian had made her his special project, his innovation associate, a title that meant, in practice, that she did whatever he needed done and called it strategy. I don't blame Chloe for what happened. I want to say that clearly, right up front, because a lot of people who've heard pieces of this story assume she was some kind of villain, and she wasn't. She was 23 and trying to survive her first real job, and she had absolutely no idea what she was holding when she held it. I was in the communal kitchen, staring at the espresso machine like it might, if I glared hard enough, dispense some kind of cosmic clarity along with my Americano, when Chloe bounced in, laptop bag over one shoulder, oblivious to the fact that I was radiating a very clear and very unambiguous do not engage frequency. "Hey, Renee, quick question," she said, already pulling out her laptop before I'd answered. "I'm scrubbing the IP attribution language on the Meridian data room deck. Julian wants everything clean before the diligence team gets access next week. I saw your name tagged on some of the legacy architecture docs, and I just wanted to check. Can I go ahead and swap that to Cipherline proprietary technology wholly owned, just to keep the language consistent across the deck?" I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold. Not hot, cold. The specific cold of liquid nitrogen. The cold that doesn't burn so much as it stops things from moving at all. "Chloe," I said, and I made sure my voice came out level, almost gentle. "Can you pull that deck up for me? I want to make sure the formatting's consistent before it goes anywhere near an investor." "Oh, totally, yeah." She turned her screen toward me, scrolling to slide 14, and there it was, laid out in bold sans serif, the exact architecture diagram I'd hand-drawn on a whiteboard in my apartment 4 years earlier, now labeled in a clean corporate font, Aegis Core Engine, property of Cipherline Inc., wholly owned subsidiary technology, no third-party licensing encumbrances. No third-party licensing encumbrances. That was the sentence that mattered. That was the sentence that turned a bad taste internal power struggle into something with a name in a courtroom. Under the terms of the master license, Cipherline held exclusive usage rights to Aegis, broad rights, generous rights, rights that let them build a real business on top of my work. But usage rights are not ownership. Telling your own marketing team you own something you merely license is embarrassing. Telling a $650 million acquirer in an official diligence document during a formal transaction that you own something free and clear when you do not, that isn't a communications problem. That's fraud. Material, actionable, put it in front of a judge fraud. And Julian Voss had just had a 23-year-old innovation associate write it down for him, in writing, with a timestamp. "Interesting," I said, keeping my voice as flat and unbothered as I could manage. "Chloe, can you email me that deck? I just want to double-check a couple of the technical diagrams for accuracy before it goes to Meridian." "Oh my God, yes, of course, thank you so much." She was already tapping away, relieved, grateful, completely unaware that she had just handed me the exact ammunition I would eventually use to help end her boss's career. "You're the best, Renee, seriously." Poor Chloe. She had no idea. I walked back to my desk and waited for the notification chime. It came 4 minutes later. Meridian_pitch_V7_final.pptx. I did not scream. I did not march into Julian's office and flip his standing desk, tempting as the mental image was. I opened my personal email. Never, ever use your corporate account for the kill shot. That's rule number 1 if you ever find yourself in this position. And forwarded the deck to Sarah with exactly 4 words. "Timestamp this. Call me." She replied in under 3 minutes. Received. "This is Section 7 territory. Do you want to move on this now or do you want to wait?" I stared at the blinking cursor for a long time before I answered. If I pulled the revocation lever right then, quietly, in the middle of a normal work week, Julian would spin it. He'd tell the board I was an unstable founder, sabotaging a life-changing deal out of ego and spite. He'd tell Meridian I was a legal liability who needed to be managed out. He was good at narrative. Genuinely, dangerously good. The kind of good that comes from having done this exact playbook before, at other companies, to other people, who probably weren't as prepared as I was. I needed something bigger than a quiet legal filing. I needed him to commit to the lie in public, loudly, in front of witnesses, in a room with no way to walk it back later. Wait, I typed. Let him dig deeper. I want the humiliation to be total when it happens. Understood, Sarah wrote back. You're a genuinely terrifying client. You know that? I'm glad you're on my side. The next few weeks passed in a strange, suspended kind of surrealism. The sensation you get in the seconds after you slip on ice and before you actually land. That stretched, floating half-second where you already know exactly how bad it's going to hurt. And there is nothing left to do but wait for gravity. I sat in meetings where the future of Aegis got discussed by people who had never read a single line of the code that made it run. I watched Julian strut around the office, practically vibrating on the fumes of a 9-figure exit, high on his own inevitability. He bought a gong, an actual brass gong, mounted on a little wooden stand by the elevators. And every time the deal cleared another diligence milestone, he'd stride over and strike it, grinning, while the marketing team cheered. Legal review complete. Bang. Financial audit passed. Bang. Every strike of that stupid gong was, as far as I was concerned, one more nail hammered neatly into his own coffin, and he had no idea he was the one holding the hammer. He thought my silence, through all of it, meant I'd folded. He thought I was a nerd he could bully into submission with enough condescension and enough meetings I wasn't invited to. He genuinely did not understand, and this, I think, is the single most important thing to know about men like Julian Voss. That for an engineer, silence isn't emptiness. Silence is processing power. Silence is a system compiling, quietly, invisibly, right up until the moment it executes. He called me into his office on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the kitchen incident, 4 days before the Meridian deal was scheduled to sign. The sun was going down over the bay, throwing long orange bars of light across his glass walls. The kind of light that makes even a mediocre man look, briefly, like he belongs on a movie poster. He didn't offer me a seat. "Renee," he said, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of him like a man who'd watched one too many films about corporate villains and taken careful notes. "We need to talk about your transition." "Transition," I repeated, playing dumber than I felt. "The Meridian deal closes Monday. They want a clean leadership story going into the new chapter, and frankly, your comp package is heavy for the role you're actually playing at this point." He said this with a straight face, to the woman whose invention had generated every dollar of revenue the company had ever booked. "We'd like to offer you a graceful exit. 3 months severance, a nice reference, and you sign a release confirming any residual IP claims are fully assigned to Cipherline as part of the exit package. Clean and simple." "And if I don't sign it?" He smiled, that shark smile, the one that never once touched his eyes. "Then we terminate for cause, insubordination, failure to align with company direction. And we make sure the market understands exactly why, so that patent of yours becomes very hard to license to anyone who's ever heard your name mentioned in a legal context." He was threatening to fire the patent holder. He was threatening to sue the person who owned the thing his entire acquisition depended on, over the things she owned. It was such a profound, almost beautiful piece of stupidity that I genuinely had to fight the urge to laugh out loud in his office. "I'll think about it," I said instead. "You have until the all-hands tomorrow morning." "Wouldn't dream of missing it," I said, and walked out. I didn't go home that night. I went down to the server room, where the cooling fans hum in a low, constant frequency that has always felt to me like the closest thing to a lullaby I've ever found as an adult. I sat on an overturned crate for almost 2 hours, watching the status lights blink green, green, green. Everything working exactly the way it was supposed to work. And I thought about tomorrow. Tomorrow, I thought. Those lights are going to turn red. And it isn't going to be an accident. The main conference room at Cypherline was, like at seemingly every startup with more funding than architectural imagination, a glass-walled box in the center of the open floor plan, universally known, affectionately, bitterly, depending who you asked, as the fishbowl. Its entire design philosophy was transparency. Its actual function was public theater. If you got yelled at in the fishbowl, 40 people watched through the glass pretending very hard to be absorbed in their monitors while missing absolutely nothing. The morning of the all-hands, the fishbowl was packed past capacity. Employees crowded 3 deep against the glass outside for anyone who couldn't fit at the table. 4 board members had flown in specifically for what everyone but me believed was a pre-signing celebration, and they stood along the back wall in expensive suits, picking at a catering tray of pastries like a row of very well-dressed vultures. Julian stood at the head of the table, practically humming with the specific, radiant energy of a man who believes, with his entire chest, that he is about to become a legend. I stood at the back, leaning against the wall, dressed the way I always dressed, dark jeans, black blazer, boots I could walk fast in if I needed to. Not funeral clothes, demolition clothes. "We are standing on the edge of something historic," Julian began, his voice carrying easily without a microphone, the way it always did, because Julian had never in his life needed to raise his voice to be heard. People simply made room for him. "Meridian Capital has recognized what I've been telling this company for 8 months. Cypherline isn't a security vendor. It's trust infrastructure for the next era of the internet." A ripple of applause, mostly from the marketing team. My engineers, the people who actually knew what Aegis was and how it worked, mostly looked at their shoes. To get here, we had to make hard calls. We had to pivot from a research-first culture to a growth-first culture. We had to leave behind some of the... And here he paused, turned his whole body deliberately until he was facing me directly across the crowded room, and the temperature in the fishbowl seemed to drop 10 degrees in half a second. Some of the legacy thinking that got us this far but won't get us where we're going. "Renee," he said, "not my last name, just my first, the way you'd address a disappointing employee or a child. You've been with this company since the very beginning. You wrote the original code, and for that, genuinely, we thank you." A pause, theatrical, calculated to the millisecond. "But what got us here won't get us there. We need visionaries now, not just technicians. We need people who understand that a patent is worthless if nobody's willing to buy the company that holds it." My face was burning. I kept it a stone mask anyway. Let him talk. Let him say every single word of this on the record, in front of the board, in front of 40 witnesses, with a company all-hands recording running on someone's laptop for the people dialed in remotely. "We offered Renee a generous transition package," he said, and this was the moment, right here, when he crossed the line from cruel into criminal, though nobody else in that room understood the difference yet. "She refused it. She's been threatening to hold this company's technology hostage over legal technicalities that don't reflect the reality of how this platform actually works. Aegis is Cypherline company property. It always has been." He straightened his cuffs, a small, satisfied gesture. A man tying a bow on a gift he believed was already his. "Effective immediately, Renee. Your employment with Cypherline is terminated. For cause. Security will escort you out." Two guards I had never seen before that exact morning stood up from folding chairs near the door. It was choreographed. He'd wanted this visual, the founder, physically removed, so the new era could begin with a clean stage. I looked at the board, watching me with the specific, practiced indifference of people who did not care who had built the engine as long as the car still sold. I looked at my team. Chloe looked like she might genuinely be sick. A young systems administrator named Malik, who I'd personally hired off a community college campus career fair 4 years earlier because nobody else would give him an interview without a 4-year degree, gave me a single, small, almost invisible nod. I pushed off the wall. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't launch into the monologue I could have delivered from memory about who had actually invented the air everyone in that room had been breathing for 3 years. "You're making a mistake, Julian," I said. My voice was quiet, but the fishbowl was so silent it carried like a gunshot anyway. "The only mistake," he said, sneering slightly now, confidence curdling ever so slightly into something meaner, "was thinking we needed you this long. The patent is company property, Renee. Read your contract. Now get out." Read your contract? I almost laughed out loud. The irony of it tasted like something rich and expensive, wasted entirely on a man who had clearly never read a single page of the document he was quoting from memory. I picked up my bag. I walked past the row of vultures in good suits. I walked past Julian, who was already turning back to the room, dismissing me the way you'd wave off a gnat that had briefly interrupted an important conversation. I felt every eye in that fishbowl on my back as I crossed the open floor, past the rows of desks where I'd spent 3 years debugging, stress testing, and occasionally crying quietly into my keyboard at 2 a.m. during a launch week. I felt every single one of them expecting a scene, expecting me to fight, to beg, to make it ugly. Instead, I walked to the elevators. A guard reached almost apologetically for my arm as if to guide me, and I sidestepped him without breaking stride. "I know the way," I said, and I did, better than anyone else in that building ever would. As the elevator doors slid shut, I caught one last glimpse of the fishbowl through the closing gap. Julian, already laughing at something a board member had said, lifting a flute of champagne someone had apparently had chilled and waiting since 7 that morning. He thought the game was over. He thought he'd won cleanly, decisively, with witnesses. I pulled out my phone as the elevator dropped. I opened my encrypted messaging thread with Sarah and typed 6 words. He said it. On the record. Company property. Her reply came back in under a minute. Confirmed and time-stamped. I have the recording from Malik already. Say the word, and the clock starts. I stepped out into the lobby, then out through the revolving doors into blinding California sunlight, and I stood there for a second on the sidewalk, breathing in the smell of exhaust and eucalyptus, and, underneath it, something that felt suspiciously, gloriously like freedom. "Go," I typed. 24 hours, Sarah wrote back. Then the world burns. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a detonation, the sound of a shockwave traveling out ahead of the debris, before anything visible has actually started to fall. That was my life for the next 24 hours, and I want to walk you through it slowly, because I think the waiting is the part people underestimate most in stories like this one. Everybody wants the explosion. Almost nobody appreciates the discipline it takes to sit calmly in the blast radius you built yourself and simply wait. I went home to my apartment in the sunset. A clean, minimalist space, pale oak floors, a single server rack humming quietly in the hallway closet like a sleeping animal. because old habits die harder than old grudges. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't check LinkedIn to see whatever spins Cypherline's communications team was already drafting. I could have written the headline in my sleep. Cypherline announces leadership evolution ahead of next growth chapter. Instead, I made tea. I sat on my small balcony, watching fog roll in low over the rooftops, and I thought about the email that was, at that exact moment, sitting unread in the inbox of Cypherline's general counsel. Sarah had sent it at 11:04 that morning, 4 minutes after I'd said the word go. Time to the minute, so there would never be a single argument later about when the clock had actually started. Notice of license revocation. Immediate action required. To the General Counsel of Cypherline, Inc., CC, Board of Directors. Pursuant to Section 14B of the Master License Agreement dated 5 years prior, licensor Renee Vaughn, through Vaughn Holdings, LLC, hereby exercises her right to revoke all usage rights to United States Patent number 11203-884-B, the Aegis Core Engine, on the grounds of material breach of contract, including, but not limited to, 1. False representation of ownership to a third party in a formal transactional context in violation of Section 7, and 2. Termination of the licensor without cause in violation of Section 12, Founder Protections. This revocation shall take full legal effect 24 hours from the timestamp of this notice. Cypherline, Inc. must immediately cease all use of the licensed technology upon expiration of this window, or face immediate injunctive action and litigation for ongoing patent infringement. It was, in the plainest terms I know how to use, a kill switch, legal, documented, and utterly unstoppable once triggered. Julian wouldn't see it right away. He was, at that exact moment, almost certainly somewhere loud and expensive, being congratulated by people who thought his company had just cleared its final hurdle before a life-changing payday. General Counsel, a perpetually harried man named Marcus Dell, who I'd always found more anxious than actually competent, would probably flag the email as urgent and then, correctly reading the room, decide not to interrupt anyone's celebration lunch with it. They would assume, if they thought about it at all before the deadline, that it was a bluff, a desperate negotiating tactic from a bitter, recently terminated employee. That assumption, I knew, would buy me almost the entire 24 hours in near total peace. I poured myself a glass of a nice Pinot Noir I'd been saving for no particular reason, and watched the sun sink behind the fog bank. Around 4 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed. A text from Malik. Vibes are extremely weird here. Marcus just sprinted into Julian's office looking like he'd seen a ghost. Julian is yelling. You good? I smiled, alone, on my own balcony, in a way I hadn't smiled in months. The shockwave had arrived. I'm great, I typed back. Just doing some gardening. Keep your head down and don't touch anything on the production servers today. Whatever happens, that's not on you. By 6 o'clock, the first call came through. It wasn't Julian. He was, I would learn later, too proud, and possibly too genuinely frightened to be the one to make first contact. It was Marcus. Renee, he said, his voice tight and strained in a way I'd genuinely never heard from him before. We received a concerning document from your counsel this morning. Hi, Marcus. I took a slow sip of wine. I assume you mean the revocation notice. Look, let's not be hasty about this. He was reaching for a conciliatory tone and landing somewhere closer to panic. Julian was emotional today. We can reclassify this as a layoff, retroactively, with an enhanced severance package. But pulling the license entirely, Renee? That's a nuclear option. You'd be destroying the company's entire value. The company has no value without a license to my IP, Marcus. Julian made that extremely clear this morning, in front of 40 witnesses and a board of directors, when he told everyone the technology belongs to Cipherline outright. I'm simply clarifying the situation for anyone who might be confused. Renee, be reasonable. Meridian signs Monday. If there's a cloud over the core IP, they'll walk. That sounds like a Julian problem, I said, not a Renee problem. You have 17 hours left, Marcus. I hung up. I blocked his number, more out of tidiness than spite. Then Julian's name lit up my screen. I let it ring once, twice, watched it go to voicemail. He called again almost immediately. And again. 11 times in 20 minutes, according to the call log I checked later. Mostly out of professional curiosity, the way you'd check a barometer during a storm. I imagined him in his office, tie loosened, collar damp, staring at his phone the way a man stares at a slot machine that has stopped paying out. He was used to people folding under pressure. He was used to throwing money or charm or veiled threats at a problem until it politely went away and stopped being his problem anymore. He had never, in his entire career, run into someone who genuinely did not need anything he had to offer. I didn't need his money. I had my own. I had my dignity, which he had tried and failed to take from me in a glass box in front of 40 people. And I had the absolute, bone-deep certainty that I was right. Legally, ethically, factually right, in a way that made the rest of the noise feel almost irrelevant. I ordered Thai food. I watched half a documentary about deep-sea bioluminescence with the sound low. I slept that night better than I had in months. Hey, quick interruption, because I know some of you are wondering the same thing I got asked constantly once this story started circulating. Why wait? Why not pull the trigger the second he broke the contract, the moment Chloe showed you that slide? I want to explain something about corporate warfare, because it's a genuinely useful thing to understand if you're ever unlucky enough to find yourself in a similar spot. Timing isn't cruelty. Timing is armor. If I had revoked the license quietly, privately, in the middle of an ordinary week, Julian would have had room to maneuver, room to spin it, to settle it fast and quiet, to make me the villain in a story only 3 people ever heard. By waiting for him to say it out loud, in public, on the record, in front of a board of directors who could later be deposed about exactly what they'd witnessed, I removed every single one of his exits. That's not cruelty. That's just good engineering. You don't pull a trigger until the shot is guaranteed to land exactly where you need it to. The next morning, I woke at 7, 4 hours before the deadline, and made coffee and waited and watched the fog burn slowly off the hills and thought, not for the first time, that there is a very particular kind of peace that only comes from knowing, with total certainty, that you have already won, and the other person simply hasn't found out yet. At 11:04 a.m., precisely 24 hours after the notice had first landed, the revocation went into effect. There was no fireworks display, no dramatic siren, nothing so cinematic as a screen going dark across an entire office floor. Aegis was still running, technically, in the servers Cipherline controlled. But every packet it processed from that moment forward was doing so in flagrant, provable, ongoing violation of federal patent law. And both Sarah and I knew it would take the company's legal team roughly 4 minutes to understand exactly how much danger that put them in. It took closer to 11. At 11:15, Malik texted me a single photo, a screenshot of an internal Slack channel, apparently forwarded to him by a sympathetic colleague who still had access, showing Marcus Dell posting in all caps in a private channel with the board, "We need to talk right now. This is not a bluff. I have read the full clause. We are in active infraction as of 11 minutes ago." At 11:40, my phone rang, and this time it wasn't Julian or Marcus. It was a number I didn't recognize, a landline, San Francisco area code, and something told me to answer it. "Renee, this is Walter Briggs." The board chair. I'd met him twice, both times at investor dinners where he'd shaken my hand for slightly less than 2 seconds before moving on to talk to someone he considered more important. His voice now had none of that casual dismissiveness left in it. "I understand there's been a significant misunderstanding regarding the license agreement." "There's no misunderstanding, Walter. Your CEO told a room full of employees and board members on the record that Cipherline owns technology it only ever had the right to license. That's not a misunderstanding. That's fraud. And I have it timestamped, recorded, and witnessed by 4 members of your own board, who I understand were standing along the back wall of the fishbowl at the time." There was a long pause on the line, the sound of a man doing very fast, very unhappy arithmetic. "What would it take," he said finally, carefully, "to resolve this in a way that doesn't require litigation?" "Nothing you're prepared to offer today," I said. "But feel free to keep calling. Clocks don't run backward, Walter. Every hour you spend negotiating is another hour of provable, ongoing infringement stacking up on top of the one from this morning." I hung up. I felt, for the first time since the whole thing began, a small flicker of something dangerously close to enjoyment. By early afternoon, the calls had stopped coming from Marcus and Walter, and had started coming, instead, from Julian himself, and the tone of his voicemails told me everything I needed to know about how badly the ground had shifted underneath him. The first one, left around 1 o'clock, was still trying for authority. "Renee, this is obviously an overreaction, and I think if we all take a breath, we can find a reasonable path forward that works for everyone." By 3, the tone had changed. "Renee, look, I think there's been a miscommunication on my end about the ownership language, and I'd like the chance to correct the record." By 5, it had changed again, into something I recognized immediately because I had watched dozens of men make this exact pivot in dozens of rooms over the years. The pivot from threat to spin to sudden, breathless generosity. Sarah called me at 5:30, and I could hear, even before she said a word, that she was smiling. "They're panicking beautifully," she said. "Walter just called me directly. They're offering you the CTO rollback, full authority over the technical roadmap, board observer rights, and a $2 million signing bonus if you reactivate the license by Monday morning before Meridian's diligence team can see the gap in the data room." "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were considering your options and that you had some concerns about the company's culture." She let that hang for a second, clearly enjoying herself. "Renee, you've got them by the throat right now, completely. What do you actually want? Because if it's money, we can get you a genuinely obscene amount of it. Meridian's counsel already reached out to me separately, and I think they'd rather buy peace than watch the whole deal implode." I looked around my apartment, clean, quiet, paid for, entirely mine, in a way that owed nothing to Julian Voss or Cipherline or a board of directors who had needed less than a day to discover exactly how replaceable their CEO's confidence had been. I didn't need the money. My original patent licensing income alone had made me comfortable years earlier, comfortable in the specific, unglamorous way that means never once checking a price tag before buying groceries. I hadn't built Aegis for the payday. I had built it because it worked, because it mattered, because 5 years of my life were folded into every line of it, and Julian Voss had tried to peel my name off it like a sticker off a laptop lid. "I don't want the money, Sarah," I said. "I want the technology back. Fully. Not a license renewal, not a renegotiated agreement. I want Cipherline to dissolve the research division entirely and transfer every asset connected to Aegis back to Vaughn Holdings. They can keep the office, they can keep the gong. The engine comes home." There was a beat of silence on the line. "You understand that essentially bankrupts them," Sarah said slowly, not arguing, just confirming. "They're already bankrupt, Sarah. They just don't know it yet. Without a license, they have no product, no revenue, and no deal. I'm not destroying anything. I'm just offering to come collect the wreckage before it starts to smell. They're never going to agree to a full asset transfer voluntarily." "They will," I said, "once Meridian formally pulls out. And Meridian is going to pull out the second their diligence team runs a routine IP verification search and finds an active federal patent infringement dispute sitting on top of the exact technology they're paying $650 million for. That's not a threat, Sarah. That's just how due diligence works." I was right. It took exactly 2 more days. The standoff lasted 3 days, and I want to be honest with you about something. It wasn't peaceful the whole way through. People imagine revenge as this clean, satisfying arc where the wronged party sits back with a glass of wine and watches everything burn without a flicker of doubt. That's not how it actually feels. There were moments, that second night especially, when I lay awake at 3 a.m. doing the math on how many people at Cipherline were about to lose their jobs because of a decision I had made. Good people. People who'd had nothing to do with Julian's fraud. People like Malik, who had a younger sister he was putting through community college on his salary. I want you to understand that I felt that weight. I carried it the entire time. But I want you to also understand the thing that let me sleep anyway, which is this. I didn't do this to them. Julian did. I simply stopped subsidizing a lie with my silence. Let me tell you a quick story from a decade ago, because I think it explains something about why I built the guardrails around Aegis as tightly as I did, and why, when the moment came, I didn't hesitate the way a kinder, less battle-scarred version of me might have. My first real job out of grad school was at a mid-sized security firm you've probably never heard of, working under a man named Boone. It doesn't matter what his name was. Honestly, he doesn't deserve the ink. Who took an anomaly detection framework I designed for a client engagement, presented it to the executive team as his own original strategic vision, and got promoted to VP off the back of it 3 months later. I found out because a colleague mentioned, in passing over lunch, that his framework looked suspiciously like something I'd sketched out on a whiteboard 8 months earlier. I went to HR. I had my notebooks, my time-stamped design documents, my version control history. HR told me, almost sympathetically, that attribution disputes in collaborative environments are notoriously difficult to adjudicate, and that I should consider it a learning experience about how visibility works in corporate settings. I quit 4 months later. I never got the credit. I never got so much as an apology. And I promised myself, sitting in my car in that parking lot with a box of desk plants exactly like the one I'd carry out of Cipherline a decade later, that I would never again build something valuable without building an ironclad wall of paperwork around it first. That's the whole secret, if you want it. It isn't genius. It isn't luck. It's just refusing, ever again, to let your work exist somewhere you don't legally control. Hey, if any of you have your own version of that story, the one where somebody took credit for something you built, I'd genuinely love to hear it in the comments. Not for the drama, just because I think more of us have lived through some version of this than most workplaces are comfortable admitting. Okay, back to the collapse. On the morning of the second day, Meridian's diligence team, running a standard IP verification search as part of the final closing checklist, flagged an active, publicly filed patent dispute connected to Cipherline's core technology stack. By noon, Meridian's general counsel had called Walter Briggs directly to inform him, with the specific brand of icy corporate courtesy that means someone is genuinely furious underneath it, that the fund would not be closing on any transaction involving an asset with unresolved federal litigation attached to its central IP. The $650 million deal, the one Julian had rung a literal brass gong for, milestone by milestone, for the better part of a year, died, quietly, in a single afternoon phone call, without a single press release or dramatic announcement. It just stopped existing. Cipherline's private valuation, which had been marked up aggressively in anticipation of the closing, began collapsing almost immediately as word leaked internally, and the engineers began leaving in droves. Not fired, not laid off, just gone. Quietly submitting resignations the moment they understood there was no acquisition, no upside, and increasingly, no functioning product, since half the engineering team had already begun privately wondering whether the technology they'd been building on top of for years even legally belonged to the company that employed them. Malik texted me a photo of himself on his third day of not going into the office, standing in the lobby holding a cardboard box with his monitor and a small cactus poking out the top, captioned simply, Titanic Violin Player.jpg. I laughed out loud, alone in my apartment, for the first time in weeks. Chloe texted me too, on the second night, a longer message than I expected from her. I don't fully understand everything that's happening, but I think I understand enough. I'm sorry I asked you to change those slides. I didn't know. I quit today. I hope that's the right call. I wrote back, It's not your fault, Chloe. You were doing your job the way you were told to do it. That's on him, not you. If you ever want a reference for what you actually do well, which is more than you think, you can call me. She didn't reply for a long time, and then, finally, Thank you. That means more than you know. By the third day, Walter Briggs called Sarah directly and asked, formally, for a settlement meeting. Not a phone call, in person. Neutral ground. They're done, Sarah told me that evening, and I could hear the exhaustion and satisfaction mixed together in her voice. The specific, tired triumph of someone who has spent 72 straight hours winning a war on someone else's behalf. Meridian pulled out officially this morning. The board is in crisis mode. They want to negotiate a full resolution before this gets any messier, and I think, at this point, they'll agree to almost anything you ask for, as long as it ends the bleeding. Good, I said. Set the meeting. Somewhere with decent coffee. And Sarah, tell them I want Julian in the room, if he still has any authority left to be in a room. He does, technically, for another few days. Why do you want him there? I thought about the fishbowl, about the way he'd said her surname like a disappointed father talking down to a child, about the calculated theater of the 2 security guards waiting by the door. Because I want him to watch the ending, I said, instead of just reading about it in a headline. We met in a conference room Sarah's firm kept for exactly this kind of occasion. Neutral, expensive in a quiet way, no logo on the wall to remind anyone whose turf they were standing on. Walter Briggs arrived first, looking a full decade older than the last time I'd shaken his 2-second handshake, his tie slightly crooked in a way that told me more about the last 72 hours than any status update could have. Marcus Dell came in behind him, carrying a leather folder he clutched against his chest like a shield. And then, 4 minutes late, Julian walked in. I want to describe what he looked like because it mattered to me, and because I think it matters to this story. He still wore a good suit. He'd clearly still had his hair cut recently. But something underneath all of it had gone slack, the way a rope goes slack right before it snaps rather than after. The tension wasn't gone exactly. It had just relocated somewhere you couldn't see it anymore. He sat down across from me without a word, and for the first time since he'd walked through Cypherline's frosted glass doors 8 months earlier, he actually looked at me. Really looked. Like he was trying to solve an equation he'd previously decided wasn't worth the effort of doing correctly. "Let's not waste each other's time," Walter said, opening his folder with the careful, deliberate motions of a man handling something that might detonate. "We're prepared to offer a full asset transfer. All rights, all claims, all associated intellectual property connected to the Aegis platform, returned to Vaughn Holdings in exchange for dropping the infringement action and releasing the company and its officers from further liability related to the events of the past week. I want the research division's remaining hardware included," I said. "The dedicated inference servers, purchased specifically to run Aegis workloads. They're useless to Cypherline without a license anyway." "Fine," Walter said, almost immediately. And the speed of that concession told me exactly how thoroughly the board had already given up on saving anything. "And I want it in writing that the company acknowledges the ownership misrepresentation made to Meridian Capital, for the record, in case Meridian's own counsel ever comes looking for someone to blame besides themselves." A long pause. Walter looked at Marcus. Marcus looked briefly, unhappily, at Julian. "We can include acknowledgement language," Walter said finally, "provided it doesn't expand our exposure beyond what's already public." "It won't," Sarah said smoothly, sliding a document across the table that she had, of course, already drafted exactly to that specification 3 hours earlier. "I've kept the language narrow. It simply confirms what everyone in this room already knows to be true." Julian hadn't said a single word since sitting down. I watched him stare at the table, at his own hands, at anything that wasn't my face, and I felt something I hadn't fully expected to feel in that moment. Not triumph exactly, though there was some of that mixed in. Mostly I felt a kind of flat, clinical clarity. The same feeling I got debugging a system at 4 a.m. when the root cause of a months-old problem finally surfaced. Undeniable. Obvious in retrospect. Impossible to have missed once you finally saw it. "You know," I said, mostly to the table, though I felt Julian's eyes flick up toward me. "There's a detail in all of this that none of you have figured out yet. And I think you should hear it now, in this room, rather than discover it later, because I'd genuinely like to spare you the surprise." "What detail?" Marcus said carefully. "Even if none of this had happened," I said, "even if Julian had never claimed ownership to Meridian, even if he'd let me keep my title, given me a raise, kept me quietly in a back office while he ran his roadshow, this deal was never going to close cleanly. Not the way you thought it was." I let that sit for a second. Aegis relies on a machine learning core that has to recalibrate periodically to stay accurate. Fraud patterns shift. Attack behavior evolves. A static model degrades. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, month over month, the way any system does when the world it's modeling keeps moving and the model itself stands still. To keep detection accuracy where it needs to be for enterprise clients, where Cypherline has always marketed it, 99.6%, The system needs a specific recalibration process roughly every 2 quarters. I watched Marcus's face very carefully as I said this, because I wanted to see the exact moment the math landed for him. About 4 months ago, I finished developing a new self-correcting recalibration method, an automated feedback architecture that lets the model retrain itself against live data without human intervention. It's elegant. It solves a problem that's dogged this entire category of software for years. That's part of the license platform, Marcus said slowly, though I could already hear the uncertainty creeping into his own voice as he said it. It's not, I said. It's a separate, standalone continuation patent, developed entirely on my own infrastructure, on my own time, using a personal projects carve-out written into my original employment agreement 5 years ago. The same agreement, incidentally, that nobody at Cipherline apparently bothered rereading before you decided I was disposable. That recalibration method isn't covered under the original license. It was never assigned. It's not part of tonight's asset transfer because Cipherline never had any claim to it in the first place. I paused and let the next part land slowly, deliberately. The way you'd set down a heavy object you wanted someone to feel the full weight of. Without it, Aegis's accuracy would have started degrading within roughly 90 days of the meridian closing. Slowly at first, then noticeably. By month 6, you'd have been looking at a false negative rate serious enough that at least one enterprise client would have caught a fraud ring Aegis should have flagged and didn't, and started asking very uncomfortable questions about what, exactly, they'd just paid $650 million for. The room was completely silent. Julian had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with fluorescent lighting. Meridian would have discovered, roughly 2 quarters into owning this company, that they'd bought a system with a hidden expiration date, I continued. And by then, I would have been long gone, under no further legal obligation to anyone in this room, holding the only patch that could have fixed it. You weren't buying a perpetual motion machine, Julian. You were selling one. There's a difference. And it's a difference that was always going to catch up with you, whether or not you ever fired me. Nobody spoke for what felt like a genuinely long time. Walter finally cleared his throat, looked down at the folder in front of him, and said, in a voice that had lost whatever remained of its earlier composure, "Is there anything else we should be aware of before we sign this?" "No," I said. "That's the last surprise. I think you've had enough for 1 week." Here's the part of the story most people don't know, because it never made it into the version that got repeated at industry happy hours as a cautionary tale. It happened almost by accident, 3 days after the settlement meeting, while Malik was still helping wind down Cipherline's remaining infrastructure, a job the board had asked him to finish out at a very generous hourly rate, because he was the only person left in the building who actually understood how the servers were wired together. He called me on a Sunday night, and I could tell immediately from his voice that something was wrong, or at least something was strange. "I found something," he said. "I wasn't looking for it, I swear. I was archiving Julian's old shared drive folder before we wiped the access credentials, standard offboarding stuff. And there's a subfolder in there labeled Q3 Personal, Do Not Share. It wasn't even password protected. I think he forgot it existed." "What's in it?" "I think you need to see it yourself," he said, and forwarded it to me before I'd even finished asking why. "I want to walk you through what I found, because I think it's important, and because it changed the entire shape of what happened next. Not for me. My situation was already resolved by that point. My technology was already coming home regardless. But for everyone else who'd been sitting on Cipherline stock believing it was worth something. The folder contained a series of emails, spanning nearly 4 months, between Julian and a private buyer called Bellwether Partners. Not a venture fund, not a strategic acquirer, but a small, aggressive secondary market shop that specializes in buying founder and executive equity off the books, quietly, before a public transaction closes, at valuations pegged to whatever narrative is currently being sold to the primary buyer. In plain terms, while Julian was telling the board, the employees, and Meridian Capital that Cipherline was worth $650 million and climbing, he had also, privately, arranged to sell a significant chunk of his own personal founder equity to Bellwether at that same inflated valuation, in a transaction structured to close 2 weeks before the Meridian deal was scheduled to finalize. Meaning, he intended to personally cash out at the top of an artificially propped-up price using information about the company's true technical liabilities that he had never disclosed to Bellwether, to the board, or, obviously, to the rank-and-file employees who held ordinary equity worth nothing at all if the deal ever fell through. There was one email in particular that I read 4 times, just to make sure I understood exactly what I was looking at. It was from Julian to his personal attorney, dated roughly around the same time he'd first started asking Chloe to clean up the IP attribution language in the data room deck. Need the Bellwether close finalized before any deeper diligence starts poking at the technical dependencies. Once Meridian's team is past the surface-level review, exposure risk on the recalibration gap drops significantly for us personally, even if it eventually becomes a post-close problem for the new owners. He knew. That was the part that genuinely stopped me cold, more than anything else in the whole ordeal. Julian hadn't simply been an arrogant executive who'd overestimated his own control of the narrative. He had known, or at minimum strongly suspected, that there was a technical liability buried under the deal. He just hadn't known its precise shape, because he'd never bothered to understand the technology deeply enough to know what he was actually threatening when he threatened to fire the one person who did. And rather than address it, or disclose it, he'd simply raced to personally cash out before anyone else discovered it, planning to leave his own board, his own investors, and dozens of his own employees holding equity in a company he already privately understood was built on a ticking clock. Hey, real quick, because I think this is worth pausing on. A lot of people who've heard this story assume the moral is simply, don't underestimate quiet, competent people. And sure, that's true. That's a real piece of it. But I think the deeper lesson sitting underneath all of this is that arrogance and dishonesty aren't actually separate character flaws in people like Julian. They're the same flaw, wearing 2 different outfits. A person who lies to the people below him will, almost without exception, eventually lie to the people above him too, the second it becomes convenient. If you ever find yourself working for someone who treats truth as a tool instead of a standard, run the calculation on what else they might be willing to bend when nobody's watching. Okay, back to the fallout, because this is where it gets genuinely ugly for him. I forwarded the entire folder to Sarah that same night, along with a short note. This isn't about me anymore. This is a fiduciary duty and securities problem. Handle it however you think is right. Sarah, to her enormous credit, didn't hesitate for a second, even though nothing in the folder had anything to do with my own settlement or my own interests anymore. This is exactly the kind of thing that gets referred to the SEC and a shareholder derivative suit filed in the same week, she told me the next morning. Attempting to secretly liquidate personal equity at a valuation you privately know is compromised, while actively concealing that compromise from your own board and investors. That's not a gray area, Renee. That's the textbook definition of securities fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, stacked on top of everything else he's already exposed to. She passed the documentation to Walter Briggs directly, through counsel, with a short cover note making clear that Cipherline's board had an independent legal obligation to investigate, regardless of anything happening in my own settlement. Walter, whatever else could be said about him, moved fast once he understood the scale of what he was looking at. Faster, honestly, than I expected from a man I'd previously written off as another passive rubber stamp in an expensive suit. Within 48 hours, the board had placed Julian on immediate, unpaid leave, pending an internal investigation, frozen the Bellwether transaction before it could close, and retained outside counsel to determine whether to refer the matter to federal regulators. I found out later, secondhand, through Sarah, who'd heard it from opposing counsel in a moment of unguarded exasperation, that the Bellwether deal had been scheduled to close in 9 days. 9 days. If Malik hadn't stumbled across an unprotected folder while doing routine off-boarding cleanup, Julian Voss would have personally walked away with several $1 million in liquidated founder equity, sold at a price he already privately knew was fictional, while everyone else connected to Cipherline, the engineers, the junior analysts, the board members who'd trusted him to build something real, would have been left holding the bag when the whole structure finally came down. He wasn't just trying to steal my life's work and rebrand it under his own name. He'd been quietly planning to steal from everyone standing behind him, too, on his way out the door. And he'd very nearly gotten away with it, entirely by accident, buried in a folder he'd simply forgotten to lock. The final signing happened 11 days later. Not in a conference room this time, but in a small coffee shop in the Mission, chosen deliberately as neutral ground by Sarah, who had learned over the years that the physical location of a signature matters more than most people realize. Boardrooms make people perform. Coffee shops make people tired enough to just finish the paperwork. Walter Briggs showed up alone, without Marcus, without any of the vultures who'd flanked Julian at that all-hands 11 months of my life ago. He looked, if anything, even older than he had at the settlement meeting. A man who had spent the last week and a half discovering exactly how much damage a single hire could inflict on a company he'd spent a decade building his own reputation around. He didn't order anything. He just sat down across from me, slid a manila folder across the table, and said, simply, "You win." I opened it. Asset transfer and mutual release agreement. Full transfer of all rights, title, and interest in the Aegis platform, associated patents, source code, and dedicated infrastructure to Vaughn Holdings, LLC, effective immediately upon execution. It was all there. My code, my data. 5 years of my life, coming home in a font 12-point Times New Roman, never quite manages to make feel as monumental as it actually is. "And Julian?" I asked, signing the first page, my hand as steady as it had been the day I'd folded that leaked email in the break room all those months ago. "Under formal investigation for breach of fiduciary duty and undisclosed securities transactions," Walter said, his voice flat and tired. "Our outside counsel has already recommended a referral to the SEC on the Bellwether matter. 2 shareholder derivative suits were filed this week alone, and I expect more once word finishes spreading. He won't be running a company in this town again. Possibly not in any town once the securities piece plays out." He paused, watching me sign the second page, the third. "You know, he told the board, more than once, that you didn't have the stomach for real business. That you were a brilliant scientist who'd never survive an actual fight." "Julian confused business with bullying," I said, capping my pen. "Science is about consequences, cause, then effect, in that order every single time, whether you like the outcome or not. He just kept forgetting that part applied to him, too." Walter almost smiled at that. the first genuine, unguarded expression I'd seen on his face in the entire ordeal. "For what it's worth," he said, standing, gathering his coat. "I'm sorry it took this long for anyone on that board to actually look at what you built, instead of just looking at what he told us it was worth." "I appreciate that, Walter. I mean it." And I did, mostly. But I'd have preferred it if someone had looked a little sooner. He nodded, accepting that without argument, and left without another word, which I respected more than any longer apology could have earned from him. I sat alone in that coffee shop for a while after he'd gone, the signed folder sitting on the table in front of me, feeling something I hadn't fully expected to feel at the actual moment of victory. Not euphoria, exactly, though there was some relief mixed in underneath everything else. Mostly I felt tired, the particular bone-deep tiredness that comes after a fight that lasted far longer than it should have, against an opponent who never should have been a genuine threat in the first place, if the systems around him had been doing their job the way they were supposed to. I opened my laptop, right there at the table, and found a new email waiting in my inbox. Subject line, Future Opportunities. From David Okafor, Meridian Capital's General Counsel, the same firm whose diligence team had, entirely unintentionally, been the instrument that first cracked the whole thing open. Renee, I understand the Cipherline transaction is officially dead, and, frankly, given everything that's come to light over the last 2 weeks, I think that outcome speaks for itself. For what it's worth, several of us on the investment side remain genuinely interested in the underlying technology, separate from anything involving Cipherline's prior leadership. If you ever decide to bring the platform to market under a new entity, I'd welcome the conversation. We tend to prefer founders who actually read their own contracts. I smiled, closed the laptop, and left the email unanswered for now. Not because I wasn't interested. I was. More than I wanted to admit to myself in that particular exhausted moment. But because there was one more thing I needed to do first, before I let myself think seriously about what came next. I needed to go back and see the ruins with my own eyes. I went back to the Cipherline office exactly 1 week after signing the asset transfer agreement. I didn't strictly need to. Everything that mattered, the code, the patents, the servers, the future, was already legally, permanently mine. But I wanted my lucky cactus back from my old desk, the one my mother had given me the day I incorporated my first holding company. And if I'm being completely honest with you, I wanted to see the wreckage with my own eyes. There's a kind of closure that only comes from standing physically inside the ending of a story, rather than just reading about it secondhand. The office was a ghost town. The motivational posters marketing had commissioned during Julian's tenure, think category, own the narrative, complexity is the enemy of scale, were peeling off the walls at the corners, curling like something wilting. The gong sat exactly where it always had, silent now, faintly ridiculous, a monument to 100 small celebrations that had all turned out to be premature. Most of the desks stood empty. The engineering team had scattered to a dozen different companies within days of the deal collapsing, and honestly, I couldn't blame a single one of them. The few people still in the building looked like survivors pulled off a sinking ship, clustered in small groups near the kitchen, speaking in the low, careful tones of people who aren't sure yet whether it's safe to talk normally again. When they saw me walk in, something shifted. Nobody looked away this time the way they had those last weeks before I was fired, back when survival instinct made everyone suddenly fascinated by their own monitors whenever I passed. A few people nodded. One of the junior engineers, a woman named Priya who'd never said more than a polite hello to me in 3 years of working 2 desks over, actually smiled and said, quietly, "Good for you, Renee. Seriously." I made my way toward the fishbowl, and there he was, Julian Voss, No longer CEO of anything, technically still in a brief transitional window before his formal departure took effect, packing his own office under the mild procedural supervision of a security guard the board had assigned to make sure nothing left the building that legally belonged to the company. He looked terrible. Unshaven in a way I don't think I'd ever seen him, not once, in 8 months of watching him strut through that building like he owned the air in it. His shirt was wrinkled. The cocky, practiced gleam that had lived permanently in his eyes had been replaced with something duller, glazed. The look of a man who has spent several consecutive nights doing arithmetic he doesn't like the answer to. He was carefully wrapping a framed photograph of himself, shaking hands with someone at what looked like a magazine's annual gala, in bubble wrap, and stacking it into a cardboard box that already held a half-dozen other trophies of a career that had just quietly ended. He looked up and saw me standing on the other side of the glass. For a long moment, we just stared at each other through it. The glass wall he had used, for months, as a stage, a place designed to display his authority, to make sure everyone could watch whoever was getting yelled at or humiliated or fired had become, without a single physical change to it, a cage instead. Same glass, completely different function, depending entirely on which side of it you happen to be standing. I watched his mouth move. I couldn't hear anything through the glass, and honestly, I didn't try very hard to read his lips. It might have been, "I'm sorry." It might have been something considerably less polite. It genuinely didn't matter to me either way, and I think that surprised me more than almost anything else in the whole ordeal. How completely, thoroughly indifferent I felt, standing there, to whatever last words he had left to offer me. I didn't wave. I didn't flip him off, tempting as it briefly was. I took a sip of the coffee I'd bought on the way in, adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder, and turned away, walking back through the open floor toward the elevators, past the empty desks, past the peeling posters, past the Cipherline logo, already half scraped off the reception wall by a maintenance worker who was, presumably, being paid by the hour to erase a company that had, for all practical purposes, already stopped existing. Outside, the California sun was bright and completely unbothered by anything that had just happened 3 floors up. I pulled out my phone. A new text from Malik. "Servers are secured and mirrored. New instance is standing by whenever you're ready to migrate. Just say the word." "Go," I typed back. I walked to my car, tossed my bag onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. It turned over with the precise, well-engineered sound of a machine built by people who understood exactly what they were doing, which felt, in that particular moment, like a small and entirely deserved piece of poetry. Julian and men like him had spent months trying to steal my fire and rebrand it under a nicer font. They never once stopped to consider that fire, taken without understanding how it actually works, tends to burn the hands of whoever's holding it. I pulled out into traffic, merged onto the freeway, turned the radio up loud enough to drown out the last 8 months, and drove. Let me take you back further, because I think you need to see the negotiation that made all of this possible in the first place. The one meeting, 5 years before Julian Voss ever walked through those frosted glass doors, that decided how this whole story would eventually end, long before anyone involved knew there was a story happening at all. I met with Cipherlini's early leadership team in a rented conference room above a bank branch in the financial district, back when the company had 11 employees and a logo someone's cousin had designed for free. The CFO at the time was a sharp, unsentimental woman named Diane Castellano, who had built her reputation cleaning up cap tables for 2 other startups before they imploded, and who looked at me, across that cheap folding table, the way a poker player looks at someone who has just made an unusual opening bet. "You want to license us the technology," she said, reading through the term sheet my own attorney had drafted. "Instead of assigning us the IP outright as part of your employment agreement. That's unusual, Renee. Most engineers in your position sign the standard founder paperwork and don't think twice about it." "I'm not most engineers," I said. "And I'm not planning to think twice about it. I've done this before, sort of. Not exactly this, but close enough to have learned the lesson the hard way. I'm not assigning the patent to anyone. I'll license it to Cypherline on exclusive, generous terms. You'll be able to build a real, defensible business on top of it. But the ownership stays with me, permanently, through a holding company, with revocation rights if the agreement is ever materially breached." "That makes investors nervous," Diane said carefully. "It's a single point of failure. If you get hit by a bus, or if you leave on bad terms, the whole company's core asset walks out the door with you." "If I get hit by a bus," I said, "the holding company's operating agreement transfers the license automatically under continuity provisions my attorney already drafted. And if I ever leave on bad terms, genuinely bad terms, not just a disagreement about product direction, but bad terms, the kind where somebody tries to push me out unfairly, then yes, the technology leaves with me." "That's not a bug in this structure, Diane. That's the entire point of it. I'm not interested in building something valuable and then discovering 3 years in that the people who financed it decided they didn't need the person who invented it anymore. I've watched that happen to other people. I'm not going to let it happen to me." There was a long silence in that room. I remember the hum of the ancient window air conditioner, the smell of burnt coffee from a machine nobody had cleaned in months, the particular tension of a very young company deciding whether the technology in front of them was worth an unusual amount of risk. "And if we say no," Diane said finally, "if we insist on standard IP assignment, like every other technical hire, then I walk," I said, and I meant it completely, with a calm certainty that surprised even me a little at the time, given how thin my own savings account was in that particular season of my life. "I'll license Aegis to one of your competitors instead, on the exact same terms. I'd rather build something smaller and slower with people who respect the terms than build something enormous with people who don't." Diane studied me for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, she smiled. Not a warm smile exactly, but a genuinely impressed one. The specific expression of someone recognizing a kindred, similarly guarded species across a negotiating table. "You know," she said, sliding the term sheet back across to me, "most people who try that line are bluffing. I don't think you are." "I'm not," I said. She signed it 2 days later, after running it past the board, most of whom, I learned afterward, had genuinely never seen a founding engineer negotiate that aggressively for control over her own work before, and had spent most of the internal debate arguing about whether it was a red flag or simply good business sense. Diane, to her lasting credit, argued it was the latter. "Anyone willing to fight that hard for fair terms before we've given her a single dollar," she reportedly told the rest of the board, "is exactly the kind of person you want holding the keys to your most important asset. The alternative is someone who doesn't care enough to fight for anything, and that's a far worse problem to have." Diane left the company 18 months later for an opportunity in Austin, long before Julian Voss ever entered the picture. And I lost touch with her the way you lose touch with most people from an early chapter of your career. But I thought about her constantly during those final months at Cypherline, especially standing in that fishbowl, listening to Julian misquote a contract he'd clearly never actually read from beginning to end. I thought about how strange it was that the single most important protection in my entire career had been built by a woman who is barely a footnote in this story, 5 years before the man who tried to destroy it had even heard my name, and how completely he had failed to understand that the ground he was standing on had been engineered, deliberately and carefully, by someone who had anticipated exactly the kind of person he would eventually turn out to be. Hey, if you're the kind of person who reads employment contracts line by line before you sign them, genuinely, sincerely, good for you. I know it's tedious. I know it feels paranoid sometimes, sitting across from a friendly recruiter who's trying to make you feel like family, asking pointed questions about IP assignment clauses and revocation rights. Do it anyway. The 2 hours it takes to actually understand what you're signing will, statistically, save you from the worst professional experience of your entire life. I promise you that from experience. There's one more person from my past I want to introduce properly, because without her, I don't think any of the rest of this story happens the way it did. Her name was Dr. Adeze Whitfield, and she was the closest thing I ever had to a mentor in graduate school. A soft-spoken, formidable woman who'd spent the first 15 years of her career at a research lab where she watched over and over brilliant work by women and immigrants and people without the right last names quietly get absorbed into other people's patents, other people's publications, other people's Nobel nomination packets. By the time I met her, she taught exactly one seminar a year on intellectual property strategy for early career researchers, and she taught it like a woman delivering a warning she desperately wished she'd received herself 20 years earlier. I remember sitting in her office during office hours, maybe 8 months before I graduated, showing her an early prototype of what would eventually become Aegis, a much cruder version, running on borrowed compute time, barely functional, but already, even then, catching patterns nobody had thought to look for. She watched the demo in complete silence, and when it finished, she didn't say anything about the technology at all. She asked me a single question. Who owns this right now? Legally, on paper, not morally, not in spirit, legally. I do, I said. I built it on my own laptop, on my own time. Good, she said. Keep it that way for as long as you possibly can, and when you finally do bring it somewhere, a company, a university lab, a research grant, do not, under any circumstances, sign it away because someone tells you that's simply how these things are done. That's what they tell you when they want the answer to be easy for them and expensive for you. She leaned back in her chair, and I remember the late afternoon light coming through her office window, catching the dust in the air. The way certain moments in your life just get preserved perfectly in memory, unbidden, for reasons you don't fully understand until much later. I spent 15 years being told that fighting for ownership made me difficult, combative, not a team player. I believed it, for longer than I'd like to admit, because it's an extremely effective story to tell a young woman who wants desperately to be liked by the people funding her work. It is a lie, Renee. Every single time. The people who tell you that story are, without exception, the people who benefit most from you never learning to tell it back to them. I have thought about that conversation more times than I can count over the years, but never more than during those final weeks at Cypherline, watching Julian Voss stand in front of a glass wall telling 40 employees that I thought like a scientist instead of a businesswoman. Like those were opposing categories instead of the same discipline wearing different clothes. Dr. Whitfield had warned me a decade earlier, almost word for word, about exactly the kind of man Julian would turn out to be, and exactly the kind of language he would use to try to make his theft sound like generosity. I called her, actually, on the second night of the standoff, unable to sleep, needing to hear a voice that had seen this particular movie before. She picked up on the third ring, sounding delighted and utterly unsurprised in equal measure once I explained what was happening. "You kept the patent," she said. It wasn't a question. "I kept the patent." "Good girl," she said, and I laughed out loud for the first time in what felt like weeks, because there was something so specific and so satisfying about hearing that particular phrase in that particular tone from the one person who had actually taught me, all those years ago, exactly how to build the trap I was now standing safely on the correct side of. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. I want to hear every single detail, especially the part where he finds out." I told her the whole thing, start to finish, sitting on my balcony while the fog rolled in, and by the end of it, she was laughing so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "You know," she said once she'd recovered, "in 15 years of teaching that seminar, you are, without question, the only student who has ever actually called me back to tell me it worked exactly the way I promised it would. Most people nod along in my class and then panic and sign whatever's put in front of them the second an actual job offer shows up. I'm genuinely proud of you, Renee. I hope you know that." I did know it. I think, in some quiet, unglamorous way, that phone call meant more to me than the entire settlement agreement sitting in a folder on my kitchen table. More, even, than watching Julian's face go pale in that conference room when I explained the recalibration patent. More than the 24 hours of silence I'd made him sit through while his company quietly imploded around him. Winning a legal fight is satisfying in a cold, technical way. But hearing the person who taught you how to protect yourself tell you, decades later, that you actually listened, that's a different kind of satisfaction entirely. Warmer, and honestly, harder to come by in a life that mostly rewards you for winning arguments instead of honoring the people who taught you how. I want to back up again, briefly, to give you a fuller picture of the 8 months between Julian's arrival and my termination. Because the soft lockout wasn't just Slack channels and calendar invites. It had a texture to it. A slow accumulation of small indignities that, taken individually, sounded almost too petty to complain about, and taken together, formed something unmistakable. 3 months into his tenure, Julian organized a company offsite at a rented lodge 2 hours north of the city, ostensibly to realign the team around the new vision. I found out about it the same way most of the engineering team did, through a calendar invite that arrived 4 days before the event, listing me as an attendee, but not, notably, as a speaker or facilitator on any part of the agenda, despite the fact that the agenda's entire second day was built around a session called Understanding Aegis, the Technology Behind the Vision, led not by me, but by a product marketing manager named Dustin who had, to my personal knowledge, never once opened the actual codebase. I sat in the back of that session, in a rustic conference room that smelled like cedar and burnt coffee, and watched Dustin explain, with real confidence, a badly oversimplified and, in several places, flatly incorrect description of how the recursive trust scoring model actually worked. He used the phrase, "It basically just learns to trust people," 4 separate times, which is a little like describing a cardiac surgeon's job as basically just poking at the heart until it feels better. Julian sat in the front row, nodding along, occasionally adding phrases like, "exactly," and "that's the vision," to sentences that were, technically, wrong. Afterward, during the optional hiking break, Julian caught up with me on the trail, falling into step beside me with the easy, unbothered confidence of a man who genuinely believed he'd done nothing wrong. "Great session today, right?" he said. "Dustin's really got a gift for making the technical stuff accessible." He described gradient descent as basically vibes, I said. Julian laughed, that same short barking sound. "See, that's exactly the kind of engineer brain gatekeeping I need you to work on, Ren. Not everyone needs the PhD version. They need the story version. Stories sell. Math doesn't. Math is the reason the story is true, I said. Take away the math and it's just a story. And stories that aren't true eventually get discovered not being true, usually by someone with a lot more leverage than a hiking trail full of employees. He didn't have a response for that. Or if he did, he chose not to give it, and instead changed the subject to a restaurant recommendation for the team dinner that night, a pivot I would come to recognize over the following months as one of his signature moves. Deflect, redirect. Keep moving forward as though the previous exchange had simply never happened. It was, I'll admit, an effective technique against most people. It relied entirely on the other person eventually getting tired of pushing. I never did. There were smaller moments, too, the kind that are almost embarrassing to admit mattered as much as they did. My badge access to the executive floor's private conference room, which I'd used for years for confidential architecture reviews, quietly stopped working one Tuesday, with no explanation and no notification. And it took 3 separate requests to facilities over 2 weeks before anyone restored it, by which point I'd simply stopped asking and started holding those reviews in a corner of the open floor instead, which everyone understood, correctly, as a demotion, even though nobody ever used that word out loud. My name was removed from the company's external leadership page on the website sometime in month 5, replaced with a stock photo of Julian and 2 other executives standing in front of a whiteboard covered in words like synergy and paradigm, arms crossed, looking exactly like every other leadership photo taken at every other company in the history of leadership photos. I only noticed because a former colleague texted me a screenshot, confused, asking if I'd left the company without telling anyone. I hadn't left. I was still there, every single day, quietly filing my continuation patent, quietly documenting every slight in a notebook I kept specifically for that purpose. Dates, times, exact language. The same discipline Dr. Whitfield had drilled into me a decade earlier. I want to be honest with you. There were nights during those 8 months when I genuinely considered just leaving on my own terms, walking away with my dignity intact and my patent still fully mine, and letting Cypherline collapse under its own weight without my involvement at all. Sarah actually raised that option with me directly, sometime around month 6. You could just resign, she told me, during one of our regular check-ins, which by that point had become almost a form of quiet, ongoing therapy as much as legal strategy. Walk away clean. Let the license lapse on its natural terms whenever the agreement runs its course. You don't have to wait for him to fire you and hand you a bigger legal claim. You've got enough documented breaches already to walk with dignity and never look back. I know, I said. I've thought about it. So why haven't you? I thought about it for a long moment before I answered, because I wanted to give her the honest answer, not the easy one. Because he's going to do this to somebody else, I said. Maybe not the exact same version of this, but some version of it. Men like Julian don't learn from quiet exits. They learn from public ones. If I walk away clean and quiet, he gets to keep telling himself, and every board he ever sits in front of again, that scaling a company sometimes means making hard calls about legacy personnel. I want him to understand, in a way he can never talk his way around afterward, exactly what happens when you do this to the wrong person. Sarah was quiet for a moment. That's not really a legal strategy, Renee. That's just justice. Same thing sometimes, I said. It just takes longer to file the paperwork. I should tell you a little more about Sarah, because she's been a name in this story for a while now without much shape to her, and she deserves better than that, given everything she did for me. Sarah Okonkwo Reyes ran a small IP litigation practice out of a converted loft in Soma, 3 attorneys total, including herself. A deliberately tiny operation because, as she told me the first day we met, big firms take instructions. I give them. She'd built her entire career representing individual inventors and small founders against exactly the kind of corporate maneuvering Julian eventually attempted. Engineers whose work got quietly absorbed, scientists whose names disappeared from patents filed by their former employers, the unglamorous, unbylined casualties of an industry that loves to celebrate visionaries and rarely bothers asking who actually built the thing the visionary is standing in front of at the press conference. I hired her the week I first incorporated Vaughn Holdings, years before Cipherline ever entered the picture, on the recommendation of another founder I'd met at a conference who described her, with real reverence, as the person you call when you're worried, not the person you call after you should have been worried. I liked that description enough to call her the following Monday. The day Julian Voss was formally announced as Cipherline's new CEO, I called Sarah before I'd even finished reading the press release. "Tell me about him," she said, without any preamble, because that was how our calls always started by that point. No small talk, straight into the work, which I'd come to appreciate more than almost anything else about our relationship. Growth operator, track record of scaling companies toward acquisition. 2 prior companies got acquired within 18 months of him joining. One got shut down entirely 14 months after its acquisition closed, once the acquirer discovered the technology didn't actually do half of what had been represented during diligence. And the founding engineer on that one? Sued for breach of representations in the original licensing terms. Settled quietly. Non-disparagement clause, so there's almost nothing public about what actually happened. There was a pause on the line. The specific pause I'd come to recognize as Sarah doing rapid mental math about risk. "Renee," she said finally, "I want you to start documenting everything, starting today. Every meeting, every email, every offhand comment about the technology's ownership. Save it externally, not on company infrastructure. If this man's pattern holds, you're looking at a 15 to 20-month runway before he tries something. I'd rather we be sitting on 18 months of clean documentation than scrambling to reconstruct a timeline after the fact." "You think he's going to try to take the patent?" "I think men who've done this exact thing successfully twice before don't stop doing it just because the third company has slightly better legal protections. I think he probably doesn't even fully understand your license terms yet, because men like that rarely read the fine print on anything. They hire people to summarize it for them, and the summary conveniently tends to skip the parts that are inconvenient to their timeline. I think you should assume he'll eventually either misunderstand your ownership structure or deliberately misrepresent it. And I think we should be ready either way." She was right, of course, on every count, though it took him 8 months instead of the 15 to 20 she'd estimated. Julian, it turned out, moved faster than his prior pattern would have suggested, probably because Meridian's interest had accelerated his entire timeline in ways his previous playbooks hadn't accounted for. From that first phone call forward, Sarah and I built a quiet, methodical case file, meeting every few weeks, sometimes just for 15 minutes, to review whatever new documentation I'd gathered. She drafted the revocation notice template almost a full year before I ever needed to send it, updating it periodically as new incidents accumulated, the way you'd maintain a fire extinguisher you hoped you'd never actually need to use. "Most of my clients," she told me once, near the end of that whole ordeal, over a celebratory dinner we finally allowed ourselves once the settlement was fully signed, "come to me after the fire's already started. You're the only person I've ever worked with who called me while the building was still just being constructed and asked me to help design the exits before anyone had even moved in. I want you to understand how rare that is. Most people don't think that way. Most people want to believe the best about the person shaking their hand across a negotiating table, right up until the exact moment that belief costs them everything. I used to be one of those people, I told her, and I meant it. It cost me exactly once. I decided that was the only time I was ever going to let it. She raised her glass to that, and I raised mine back. And for a moment, sitting in a quiet restaurant in a city that had spent the last decade slowly teaching me exactly how much protection a person needs to build around their own work before anyone else is entitled to touch it, I let myself feel, fully and without reservation, something that felt very close to peace. I gave myself exactly 2 weeks after the coffee shop signing before I let myself think seriously about what came next, because I've learned, the hard way, that decisions made in the immediate afterglow of a victory tend to be worse than decisions made after you've had time to actually rest. I slept in. I took long walks along the water with no particular destination. I called my mother, who still lives in the same San Jose apartment I grew up in, even though I've offered a dozen times to move her somewhere nicer. And I told her the entire story, start to finish, sitting on her worn floral couch while she made me a pot of tea I hadn't asked for and didn't need, but drank anyway, because refusing it has never once been an option in that household. "You kept the papers," she said when I finished, not really a question, in almost exactly the same tone Dr. Whitfield had used on the phone weeks earlier. And I realized, hearing it, that this was simply what the women who had shaped me sounded like when they were quietly, deeply proud of me, without wanting to make a production of saying so directly. "I kept the papers," I confirmed. "Good," she said, and patted my knee, the exact same gesture she'd used my whole childhood whenever I brought home a good report card or fixed something around the apartment that was supposedly beyond a 12-year-old's abilities. "Your father always said paperwork was boring." I told him boring things are usually the ones that save you. My father had passed away when I was 19, and my mother rarely brought him up unprompted, so I sat with that for a moment, letting it settle, grateful for it in a way I didn't fully have words for at the time. David Okafor from Meridian called again 2 weeks after that, more formally this time, requesting an actual meeting rather than just an email. I said yes, on the condition that Sarah sat in on every conversation from the very first call, a condition he agreed to without hesitation, which told me something useful about how differently this negotiation was going to go compared to the one I'd walked into with Cipherline 5 years earlier. "We'd like to discuss investing in whatever comes next," he told me, in a conference room that smelled like good coffee instead of burnt coffee. A small but genuinely meaningful upgrade in my life. "Not an acquisition. Growth capital. Board observer rights. Standard terms. But structured specifically around your ownership retention preferences. Frankly, after what we watched happen at Cipherline, I think most serious investors in the space are going to be a lot more careful about how they structure deals with technical founders going forward. You've inadvertently done the entire industry something of a favor." I laughed at that, genuinely, for the first time in the whole meeting. "I wasn't trying to reform venture capital, David. I was trying to keep what was mine." "Sometimes those turn out to be the same project," he said, and I decided, in that moment, that I liked him considerably more than I'd expected to like anyone associated with the word Meridian after everything that had happened. I founded the new company 2 months later. Meridian had actually suggested keeping some version of the Aegis name, arguing there was brand value in the technology's existing reputation among enterprise clients, but I chose something new instead. Vaughn Systems. Plain, unglamorous, entirely honest about whose name was on the door and whose name would stay there. No gong, no motivational posters, No glass-walled conference room designed for public theater. I found a small office in Oakland instead. Real windows, decent light, a kitchen with a coffee machine nobody had to fight over, and a single conference room with a door that closed and a whiteboard that only ever had my actual architecture diagrams on it, drawn correctly, by people who'd actually built the thing they were explaining. I structured the founding documents myself this time, with Sarah's help, building in every protection I'd learned the hard way over the previous 5 years, plus several new ones neither of us had thought of the first time around. Founder IP retention with automatic revocation triggers. Mandatory attribution clauses in any external marketing or investor material, with financial penalties for violations, not just apologetic corrections. A board seat structure that gave technical leadership genuine binding input on any acquisition or leadership transition decision, not just a courtesy invitation to a meeting where the decision had already quietly been made weeks earlier. Investors who balked at any of it, and a few did, got a polite, unbothered no. And I found, somewhat to my surprise, that turning down money on principle felt considerably better than I'd expected it to. There is a specific, quiet satisfaction in discovering that you no longer need anyone badly enough to compromise on the things that actually matter. And once you've felt that particular kind of satisfaction, it's very hard to ever go back to negotiating from a place of fear again. Hey, quick note for anyone building something of their own right now. Wherever you are in that process, I know most of you watching this aren't sitting on a patent worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's completely fine. That's not actually the point of any of this. The point is smaller and more universal than that. Whatever you're building, whatever you're contributing, wherever you're currently the person doing the actual work, while somebody else gets the credit in the room you're not invited into, start writing it down. Start keeping your own records. Start asking, quietly, patiently, exactly what you're entitled to before you find out the hard way that you assumed wrong. It's not paranoid. It's just responsible stewardship of your own future. Okay, back to the story because there's one more piece of it I need to tell you. The first call I made after the founding paperwork was finalized was to Malik. "I already know what you're going to ask," he said before I'd gotten more than 2 sentences into it. "And yes, obviously, are you kidding me? I've been sending out applications for 3 weeks and every single interview keeps asking me to explain what happened at Cypherline. And I'm so tired of telling strangers the story. Just let me come build something with you again instead of talking about it." "Same title," I told him. "Better equity this time. Actually, meaningful equity, not the confetti amount they gave you the first time around. And I need you to help me set up infrastructure the right way from day one. No shortcuts, no, we'll fix the security posture once we're bigger." "Renee, I would follow you into a burning building at this point. Just say when." Chloe was harder to reach, and I understood why. She'd taken a job at a completely unrelated company after Cypherline collapsed. Something in operations at a logistics startup. And I think part of her genuinely believed she wasn't welcome to come back into this particular world after what had happened, even though none of it had ever actually been her fault. I called her on a Sunday afternoon, and there was a long pause after I asked if she'd be interested in a role. "I don't really have technical background," she said finally, quietly. "I know operations gets called soft skills sometimes, like it doesn't matter as much as engineering does. I don't want to be somebody's mistake twice." "Chloe, you weren't a mistake the first time. You were 23 years old, doing exactly what your manager told you to do, in good faith, with no reason to believe he was lying to you. That's not a character flaw. That's just what it looks like to be young and trusting in an industry that occasionally punishes both of those things far more harshly than it should. And for what it's worth, operations isn't soft. Operations is the thing that keeps a company from collapsing under its own good intentions. I need someone who actually understands how to build clean, honest processes from the ground up. Someone who's already seen exactly what it looks like when those processes get abused, so she knows precisely what not to repeat. That's you. That's specifically you, and nobody else I could hire. She cried a little on the phone, which she apologized for immediately, and I told her, honestly, not to bother apologizing for. And she started at Vaughn Systems 3 weeks later, running operations and, eventually, a significant chunk of our vendor and contract review process, where her particular hard-won instinct for noticing when language in a document doesn't quite match reality turned out to be one of the single most valuable skills on our entire team. We built Vaughn Systems slowly, deliberately, over the following 18 months, and I want to tell you honestly that it wasn't some fairy tale, frictionless second act. There were genuinely hard weeks. There was a client integration that failed catastrophically at 3 a.m. and required Malik and me both awake for 11 straight hours fixing it, while I questioned every decision I'd ever made in my life. There was a competitor who tried, briefly and unsuccessfully, to poach 2 of our early engineers with an aggressive signing bonus, and I watched both of them turn the offer down without hesitation and felt something warm and slightly overwhelming about the fact that people were choosing to stay this time, not because they were trapped, but because they actually wanted to be there. What was different, genuinely, structurally different, not just different in feeling, was that every single person in that building understood from their very first day exactly what they owned, exactly what the company owned, and exactly what would happen if either side ever tried to quietly blur that line. I put the entire framework in our employee handbook, in plain language, no legal jargon buried in an appendix nobody reads. Your work is your work. Attribution matters here, formally, contractually, not just as a nice sentiment on a poster. If you build something that becomes core to this company, we will have an honest conversation about what that means for your ownership stake, before you have to hire a lawyer to force that conversation to happen. I meant every word of it, and 18 months in, I'd never once had to actually invoke any of the enforcement mechanisms I'd built into it, because it turns out that when people trust the structure they're operating inside, they rarely feel the need to test whether the structure actually holds. I think that's the real difference between Cipherline and Vaughn Systems, if I'm being completely honest with you. It was never really about the technology. Aegis worked exactly the same way, technically, in both buildings. What changed was who the technology, and the people who maintained it, were allowed to actually belong to. I want to close out Julian's part of this story properly, because I know some of you are wondering what actually happened to him, and I think he deserves at least a complete accounting, even if I'm not particularly inclined to feel sorry about any of it. The SEC investigation into the Bellwether transaction took just over a year to fully resolve, which Sarah told me was actually remarkably fast for that kind of case, mostly because the documentation Malik had stumbled across was so thorough and so damning that there was very little ambiguity left for anyone to litigate. Julian ultimately settled with the commission rather than fight it through to trial. A common outcome, Sarah explained, for defendants whose lawyers have run the numbers and concluded that a public trial would only expose more embarrassing detail than a quiet settlement ever would. He agreed to a significant financial penalty, a multi-year bar from serving as an officer or director of any public company, and a formal admission of wrongdoing on the securities charge, though notably not on the broader IP misrepresentation, which had already been resolved separately in my own settlement and never went anywhere near a courtroom. 2 of the shareholder derivative suits settled quietly for undisclosed amounts, paid, as far as I understand it, largely out of Cipherline's directors and officers insurance policy, rather than out of Julian's own pocket, which is its own kind of quiet injustice I've made a kind of peace with, mostly by reminding myself that the officer bar and the securities admission followed him permanently, in a way no insurance payout ever could. A journalist covering the venture world wrote a fairly thorough piece about the whole collapse roughly 8 months after everything settled. I read it once, late at night, alone, and then never looked at it again. Because there's a version of closure that comes from reading the public accounting of your own worst professional chapter. And I found, once I'd gotten it, that I didn't actually need to revisit it a second time. The piece was headlined with the kind of dry irony business journalists specialize in: the $650 million deal that died because nobody read the license agreement. And it quoted, unnamed, a person close to the matter, describing Julian's downfall as a masterclass in what happens when you underestimate the person who actually understands the technology better than you do. I have my suspicions about who that unnamed source was. Walter Briggs and I had exchanged exactly one more phone call by that point. A brief, oddly cordial one, in which he told me he'd left the board entirely and taken a much smaller advisory role somewhere in Seattle, choosing, in his words, to spend the rest of my career actually reading contracts before I sign them. Julian, as far as I've been able to tell secondhand, through the specific grapevine that exists in any tight-knit industry, has not run another company since. He reportedly tried, roughly a year after everything settled, to raise a small seed round for a new venture under a friend's name as the listed founder, with himself positioned quietly as an advisor. And the story, as it was relayed to me by someone who'd sat in on the pitch, is that at least 2 of the investors in the room recognized his name immediately, excused themselves for a bathroom break that lasted considerably longer than a bathroom break should, and never returned to the meeting. I don't know if that particular detail is entirely accurate. Industry gossip has a way of sharpening itself with each retelling, but I choose to believe it, mostly because it's a satisfying image, and I've decided I'm allowed at least one satisfying image out of all of this. I don't spend much time thinking about him anymore, which surprised me, honestly, more than almost anything else about the entire aftermath. I expected some lingering resentment, some itch that never quite got scratched even after the settlement and the SEC action and everything else. Instead, what I mostly feel, when his name comes up at all, is a kind of distant, clinical satisfaction. The same feeling you get closing a support ticket you've been chasing down for weeks, watching the status finally flip from open to resolved. Julian Voss was never actually the point of this story. Not really. Not to me. He was just the specific, particular obstacle standing between me and the thing that was already mine. Removing an obstacle isn't the same as achieving a victory. The victory was always the technology, coming home, exactly where it belonged, and everything else was just paperwork on the way there. A year and a half after that coffee shop signing, I stood at the front of a much smaller, much quieter room than the Fishbowl had ever been, announcing Vaughan Systems' first major enterprise contract, a regional banking consortium, 12 institutions, a deal that would never make headlines the way a $650 million acquisition would have, but that represented something I found, somewhat to my own surprise, considerably more meaningful than any acquisition ever could have. It represented a client choosing us, specifically, because of the technology's track record, not because of a narrative someone had built around it in a pitch deck designed to obscure exactly how it worked. There was no gong. I want to be clear about that because people occasionally ask, half joking, whether I bought one for the new office out of some sense of ironic ownership over the symbol. I didn't. I never will. Instead, When we close a meaningful deal at Vaughan Systems, we do something smaller and, I think, considerably more honest. Whoever on the engineering team did the actual technical work behind that specific deal gets to write a short internal note, publicly posted in our company channel, explaining what they built and why it mattered. No theater, no spectacle designed to make the person announcing it look good in front of an audience. Just an honest, specific accounting of who did the work, seen by everyone, permanently searchable, impossible to quietly erase 6 months later when someone new walks through the door with a vest that costs more than a car and an appetite for rewriting history. Malik posted the note for the banking consortium deal. It was 3 sentences long, characteristically understated, ending with a line that made me laugh out loud alone at my desk when I first read it. Also, for the record, nobody tried to claim ownership of anything during this entire integration. 10 out of 10 would build critical financial infrastructure here again. I brought Diane Castellano in as an advisor about 8 months into Vaughan Systems' life, once I'd tracked her down through a mutual contact in Austin, curious whether she'd be interested in helping shape the governance structure of a company built entirely around the philosophy she'd first taken a chance on, all those years ago, in a rented conference room above a bank branch. She said yes almost immediately and told me, during our first real conversation since she'd left Cipherline years earlier, that she'd actually heard about the whole Julian Voss debacle secondhand through industry contacts, months before I ever called her. "I knew it was your license the second I heard the deal collapsed over an IP dispute," she said. "I remember thinking, whoever that founder is, I hope to God she's the one who negotiated her terms the way I think she did. And then someone mentioned your name. And I actually laughed out loud in a client meeting, which was extremely unprofessional of me, but I regret nothing." "You built the structure that made it possible," I told her. "I just used it exactly the way it was designed to be used." "That's the highest compliment a piece of contract language can receive," she said. "Being used exactly the way it was designed to be used, at exactly the moment it was needed most. Most protective clauses just sit there for years, dead weight, never actually tested. Yours got to do its job. That's rare. And honestly, it's a little beautiful, in the specific way that only a very tired corporate attorney could find a revocation clause beautiful." I think about that conversation often, actually, more than almost any other single moment from the entire aftermath. There's a particular satisfaction in building something that works exactly as intended when it's finally called upon. Not the flashy, cinematic satisfaction of watching Julian's face go pale in that settlement meeting, though I won't pretend that didn't feel good too, in a smaller, more petty way I'm not especially proud of, but also won't pretend I didn't enjoy. The deeper satisfaction was quieter than that. It was the specific, structural satisfaction of discovering that years of careful, unglamorous preparation, reading contracts twice, keeping a notebook of documented slights, calling a lawyer before you're actually desperate enough to need one, had done exactly what it was supposed to do, at exactly the moment it mattered most, without a single wasted motion. I still drive that same car, the one I pulled out of the Cipherline parking lot in on the last day I ever walked through those frosted glass doors. Malik has offered, more than once, to help me pick out something nicer now that Vaughan Systems is, by any reasonable measure, doing very well. Genuinely, comfortably well. The kind of well that means I no longer have to think twice about a grocery bill or a plane ticket or anything else that used to require a quiet mental calculation before I let myself want it. I keep declining. There's something I like about the continuity of it, about turning the key on the exact same engine every single day and hearing it run exactly the way it always has, regardless of everything that changed around it. It feels In a small way, like proof that the important things, the things you actually build with your own hands, the things engineered carefully enough to last, don't need to be replaced just because the world around them fell apart and had to be rebuilt from scratch. I called Dr. Whitfield again about a year after Vaughan Systems officially launched, mostly just to check in, the way you do with people who shaped you at a formative moment and then quietly become friends instead of mentors, once enough time has passed for the relationship to level out into something more equal. She'd retired from teaching by then, was spending most of her time consulting for a nonprofit that helps first-generation researchers navigate exactly the kind of IP negotiations she'd once taught me about in a seminar room that smelled like old coffee and good advice. "I use your story now," she told me, sounding genuinely delighted about it. "In the very first session of my workshops, anonymized, obviously, I don't name you. I don't name the company. I don't get specific enough that anyone could ever trace it back and cause you a problem. But I tell them about a former student of mine who kept the patent, built the wall around it exactly the way I taught her to, and watched it hold up perfectly, years later, exactly when it mattered most. I tell them it's not a fantasy. I tell them it actually happens if you do the work early enough, before you think you need to." "Does it land?" I asked. "With the students, I mean." "Every single time," she said. "There's something about hearing that it's actually possible. Not just theoretically possible in a textbook, but actually, concretely, happened to a real person possible. That changes how seriously people take the boring parts of protecting their own work. Theory doesn't scare anyone into reading their contracts twice. A true story does." I think about that a lot, honestly. The idea that some version of this story is now sitting quietly in the memory of a room full of strangers I'll never meet, shaping decisions they'll make years from now, in negotiations I'll never know took place, against men they'll never have to name out loud either. There's something genuinely moving about that. More moving than I expected an anonymized case study to be. I didn't build Aegis or Vaughan Systems or any of the careful legal architecture underneath both of them, hoping it would eventually become a cautionary tale for other people. But I've come to believe that's actually the most valuable thing that came out of the entire ordeal. Not the settlement, not the company, not even the quiet, private satisfaction of watching Julian Voss's face go slack across a conference table. It's the possibility that somewhere, right now, a young engineer sitting across a folding table from a founder who seems friendly and generous and completely trustworthy is going to ask one extra question about ownership terms before signing anything, purely because some anonymized version of my worst professional year convinced her it was worth the 10 extra minutes of feeling paranoid. That's the whole thing, really, if you boil it all the way down. Power, real power, the kind that actually holds up when someone tries to take it from you, was never about being the loudest person in the fishbowl, or the one holding the champagne flute, or the one with a gong mounted proudly by the elevators. It was about a folder on an encrypted drive, a clause nobody bothered reading, and a woman who was willing to sit quietly through 8 months of humiliation, waiting patiently for the exact right moment to remind everyone in that room whose name had actually been on the engine the entire time. Before I let this story end, I want to take you back one more time to the actual building of the thing that all of this was ever really about. Because I think it's easy, hearing a story like this, to skip past the years of unglamorous labor and land only on the courtroom-adjacent parts, the revocation notice, the settlement meeting, the twist about the recalibration patent, as though the drama was the point. It wasn't. The drama was just the defense of the point. The point was 2.5 years in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. And I think it's worth telling you honestly what that actually looked like, because I suspect some of you watching this are living some version of it right now, and I want you to know it's survivable, even on the nights it doesn't feel that way. I worked a part-time contract job during the day, doing unglamorous security audits for small regional credit unions, mostly to keep my rent paid and my health insurance active. And I built Aegis at night, on a single aging desktop I'd assembled myself out of parts bought secondhand off a hobbyist forum. In a room that got so cold in the winter, I worked wearing fingerless gloves more nights than I'd like to admit. The laundromat below my apartment ran its dryers until 11 most nights, and I got so used to the low, rhythmic thrum of the machines that, for years afterward, whenever I couldn't sleep, I'd put on ambient dryer noise recordings to fall asleep to. A fact I've never told anyone until right now, on a recording an unknown number of strangers are going to listen to, which feels like an appropriately strange way to finally admit it out loud. There were nights I genuinely didn't believe it was going to work. Early versions of the trust scoring model threw false positives so aggressively that a test deployment with a small nonprofit credit union once flagged the credit union's own founder as a likely fraud risk for the crime of logging in from a new laptop while traveling. And I remember sitting at my desk at 2 a.m, staring at that error log, feeling something very close to despair. The specific despair of having spent 18 months and most of your savings on something that might simply be wrong, structurally, at the root, in a way no amount of additional effort could fix. I called Dr. Whitfield that night, embarrassed, half expecting her to tell me gently that maybe this wasn't the right approach after all. She didn't. She asked me to walk her through the exact architecture, sentence by sentence, at 2 a.m, patiently, the way only someone who genuinely loves the craft of the work itself is willing to do at that hour for a former student who isn't even paying her for the consultation. 20 minutes in, she stopped me. Your feature weighting on device fingerprinting is too aggressive relative to behavioral cadence. You're letting a superficial signal override a deeper one. Fix the ratio. I think the core idea is sound. I think you just haven't trusted it enough yet to let the harder signal do more of the work. She was right. It took me another 6 weeks of rebuilding that weighting logic from the ground up, but once I got it right, the false positive rate dropped by more than 80% almost overnight. And that specific piece of architecture, the ratio between superficial and behavioral signal, weighted correctly, finally, after weeks of getting it wrong, became the actual technical heart of everything Aegis would eventually become. The exact piece of engineering Julian Voss would later stand in front of a whiteboard, mangling with the word vibes. I tell you all of this not to pad out the ending of a story that's mostly already over, but because I think the twist people miss most about stories like mine isn't the legal maneuvering, or the revocation clause, or even the second patent nobody saw coming. The real twist, if you want to call it that, is how much invisible, unglamorous, uncinematic labor sits underneath every single moment that eventually looks dramatic from the outside. Nobody was filming me at 2 a.m. wearing fingerless gloves, debugging a feature weighting ratio with a former professor who didn't have to help me and did anyway. Nobody saw the 18 months of false starts, the credit card debt I quietly paid down over the following 3 years, the birthdays and holidays I spent alone at that desk because I was convinced, correctly as it turned out, that the work mattered enough to justify the isolation. The fishbowl, the gong, the settlement meeting, all of that only existed because of thousands of hours nobody will ever see. And I think that's true of almost every story like this one, whether or not the person telling it chooses to mention the unglamorous part out loud. So if you're in that part right now, the cold apartment part, the fingerless gloves part, the part where you're not sure any of it is actually going to work, and nobody around you seems to understand why you keep trying anyway, I want you to know that the part where it pays off doesn't announce itself in advance either. It just quietly accumulates, night after night, ratio adjustment after ratio adjustment, until one day, years later, it's sturdy enough to hold the entire weight of a man in an expensive vest trying to knock it over, and it simply doesn't move. I kept that first desktop, by the way, the one I built out of secondhand parts off a hobbyist forum. It sits on a shelf in my office at Vaughan Systems now, unplugged, a little dusty, absolutely useless by any modern technical standard, next to my mother's lucky cactus and a small brass plaque Malik had made for me as a joke that just says, in plain block lettering, "Read the fine print." New hires ask about it sometimes during their first week, when they're still getting the tour and haven't yet learned which questions are the interesting ones. I always tell them the same short version of the story, that a business idea is worth exactly nothing until you've protected your right to keep it, and that everything else, every server, every client, every dollar of revenue this company has ever made grew directly out of a decision I made at a cheap folding table years before any of them ever walked through our door. Most of them nod politely and move on to ask about the coffee machine. A few of them stop and ask a follow-up question, and those, I've found, over time, tend to be the ones who end up staying the longest. Hey, thank you so much for sticking with me through this whole saga. I know it was a long one. And if you made it all the way to the end, genuinely, I appreciate you more than a comment box could ever properly convey. If you enjoyed watching a tech bro get legally and financially dismantled by the exact quiet, overlooked person he decided didn't have the stomach for a real fight, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, because there are a lot more stories like this one coming, and it genuinely helps the channel when you do. And seriously, I mean this part sincerely, not just as a cute sign-off. Read your employment contracts. Read your licensing agreements. Ask the annoying, paranoid-sounding question about IP ownership before you sign anything. Even when the person across the table is smiling at you and telling you it's just standard boilerplate nobody actually reads. Standard boilerplate is exactly where people like Julian Voss hide the sentence that lets them take everything you built out from under you. 5 years down the road, in a glass-walled room, in front of everyone you've ever mentored. Real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear a vest that costs more than a car, and it doesn't need a brass gong to prove it's earned something. Real power sits quietly in the back of the room, keeps its receipts, and waits exactly as long as it needs to wait before it moves. Renee showed every single person who ever underestimated her exactly what that kind of quiet, documented, patient competence is capable of once it's finally allowed to speak. True authority was never about who can yell the loudest across a fishbowl. It's about who's actually holding the keys when the door finally, inevitably, gets tested. Know your worth. Protect it in writing, not just in feeling. And remember that some of the most important lessons in a career only ever get learned the hard way. But you get to choose, every single time, whether you're the one learning them or the one who already learned them years ago and is simply waiting, patiently, for someone else to find out. Thanks again for watching this whole thing through. See you in the next story.